The Crimson Hollow. In the forgotten hollows of Crimson Hollow, Kentucky, where the Appalachian hills loomed dark and the coal mines bled black into the earth, lived Samuel and Margaret Booth. Samuel, 54, was a hulking coal miner with hands like iron and a voice worn hoarse by dust. Margaret, 51, was a cook at a roadside diner called the Greasy Spoon, her apron stained from years of grease and grit. They'd been married 30 years, their life a relentless slog through poverty and silence. No children, just a rotting cabin by the railroad tracks and a marriage held together by habit and rust. But beneath their coal-crusted existence, a crimson tide was swelling, a flood of blood, betrayal and buried secrets that would drown them both. Prologue. The crimson stain it began with a stain. One frigid January night, Samuel trudged home from the night shift, his boots crunching snow, to find Margaret scrubbing the kitchen floor. The water in the bucket ran red, blood, thick and fresh, swirling against the cracked linoleum. She froze when he entered, a rag clutched in her trembling hands. "I spilled some stew," she muttered, but the air reeked of iron, not meat, and a smear of blood streaked her forearm. Samuel squinted, his miner's eyes catching the lie. "Whose blood, Maggie?" he rasped. She glared. "Leave it, Sam," and turned away, her shoulders hunched. The next morning, he found a torn scrap of paper in the trash, a receipt from a pawn shop in Lexington, 80 miles away, $20,000, cash for miscellaneous goods. Beside it, a bloodied glove, not hers, too large, leather worn at the knuckles. Samuel's stomach twisted. Margaret wasn't just hiding a mess. She was covering a crime. Chapter 1. The Hollows Whisper. A week later, Margaret claimed she was working a double shift at the diner. She left at 6 p.m., her coat bulging with something heavy. Samuel waited, unease gnawing at his bones like the cold seeping through the cabin walls. By 2 a.m., she hadn't returned. He checked her phone, off, but it had last pinged near Hollow Creek, a dry gulch 5 miles out, where miners once dumped slag and the wind carried whispers of ghosts. He grabbed his lantern and shotgun, the weight of both steadying his shaking hands, and drove into the night. The gulch was a jagged scar in the earth. Margaret's rusted Pontiac parked beside a battered Chevy pickup. Through the skeletal trees, he saw her standing in the creek bed with a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and a scar slashing his left cheek. Blood glistened on the ground beside a tarp-wrapped bundle, its edges seeping red into the snow. Margaret handed him a sack. He gave her a thick envelope. Samuel's breath caught. They weren't lovers. They were partners in slaughter. He crouched behind a pine, the lantern dimmed, watching as the man dragged the bundle into the pickup's bed. Margaret lingered, her face pale under the moonlight, then drove off. The man lit a cigarette, the flare illuminating his scarred face before he followed. Samuel stayed rooted, his mind churning. This wasn't a fling, it was a killing. Chapter 2. The scarred butcher Samuel didn't confront her, not yet. The next day, he asked his shift buddy, Roy, a wiry miner with a limp from a cave-in, about a scarred guy in the hollow. Roy's eyes narrowed. That's Luther Butcher Hayes, runs the Hollow Reapers. Meth? Guns? Bodies. Meaner than a rattlesnake, Sam. Been back in town a year, stirring trouble. Samuel hit the county clerk's records with Roy's help. Luther, 56, had a rap sheet stretching back decades. Armed robbery, trafficking, 2 suspected murders, charges always dropped, witnesses gone missing. No connection to Margaret on paper. But Roy leaned close, voice low. He's got a woman who handles the cash. Quiet type, diner folk, they say. Samuel searched her Pontiac that night while she showered. Under the passenger seat, a Bowie knife, blade crusted with dried blood, and a faded photo of Margaret and Luther, young and grinning, standing by a pickup in 85. On the back, in her looping scrawl, Luther and Maggie kin forever. Samuel's knees buckled. She'd hidden a brother, a killer, for their entire marriage. Chapter 3. The ledger of blood Samuel's suspicion turned to obsession. Margaret grew cagey, locking her purse, burning scraps in the backyard barrel, coming home with coal dust on her boots and a haunted look in her eyes. One stormy night, while she slept fitfully, he pried open a locked trunk in the attic, the hinges groaning under his miner's strength. Inside, $35,000 in blood-stained bills bundled tight with rubber bands. A leather ledger, its pages yellowed and smudged with crimson fingerprints, and a map of the hollows, excess marking spots along the creek. The ledger was a butcher's tally, dates, names, dollar amounts totaling $250,000 over 2 years. Entries like a JP snitch, 12.20, $10 K and RL, debtor, 1.5, $15 K stared back at him, some names crossed out in red ink. A note in Luther's jagged handwriting read, "She's soft." Next one's hers to finish. He flipped through the burner phone tucked beside it. Texts from Uella, Friday, Creek, $20 K, bring the goods. Sent yesterday. Samuel's hands shook, rage and fear colliding like a cave-in. Margaret wasn't just laundering money, she was neck-deep in murder. He called his old mining partner, Jack, a retired state trooper turned recluse who lived an hour away in Lexington. Jack arrived 2 days later, a lean man with grey hair and a stare that cut through bullshit. "This ain't no side hustle, Sam," he said, studying the ledger. "She's running a body count with Luther. You're in deep shit here." Chapter 4. The third blade Jack took charge, tailing Margaret the next Friday. She didn't head to the diner, but drove straight to Hollow Creek. Luther was there, joined by a third figure, short, wiry, with a pockmarked face and a missing tooth, his hands gloved in black leather. Jack snapped photos through his truck's tinted windows. Luther and the wiry man unloading a body. Fresh, a man in a torn jacket, throat slashed, while Margaret shoveled dirt over blood-stained snow. Jack called Samuel that night, voice grim. "That's Bobby Tooth Carver." Luther's cleaner, cuts 'em up and burns what's left. Margaret's the bankroll and the gravedigger. Jack planted a mic in her Pontiac the next day, slipping it under the dash while she worked. The first recording hit Samuel like a pickaxe to the chest. Luther's growl. Tooth's twitchy, he wants double. "We need 50K by next week." Margaret, her voice flat. Sam's starting to ask about the money. He's a loose end. Tooth's rasp cut in. "I'll slit him slow, make it look like a drunk." Samuel gripped his shotgun, his knuckles white. His wife had greenlit his murder. Chapter 5. The Hollows Crypt. Samuel and Jack mapped the creek's excess, starting with the closest, a shallow ditch 1/2 mile from the first drop. They dug under cover of night, the wind masking their grunts. Beneath the frozen earth, a mass grave. 10 bodies, some skeletal, some still soft with rot, all bearing knife wounds or bullet holes. Cash crates, tucked in a rusted oil drum nearby, held $180,000 in bundled bills, some stained with blood, others charred at the edge. A wall of the ditch had photos pinned with rusty nails. Margaret at kill scenes, shovel in hand, her face a mask of exhaustion and guilt. A logbook, waterlogged but legible, detailed the carnage. A JP snitch, 12.20, $10 K, throat cut. Disposed. End on 5, $15 K, shot, buried. The latest entry, ETH rat, 115, $20 K, burned. Samuel retched into the snow. She wasn't a victim. She was a reaper. He sat in the ditch for an hour, staring at the photos, piecing it together. Margaret's father had died in a hunting accident. When she was a teen, shotgun to the chest, ruled a misfire. Luther had been there, a shadow in her stories. Had he pulled her into this life then, blood binding them tighter than kin? Or had she chosen it, her quiet strength a mask for a killer's heart? Samuel didn't know, but the truth was clawing its way out. Chapter 6. The crimson confession. Samuel waited for Margaret the next night, the cabin dark, his shotgun across his lap, the ledger and knife laid out like evidence in a trial. She stumbled in at 3 a.m., reeking of gasoline and coal, her hands trembling as she dropped her coat. He flicked on the light and she froze, eyes darting to the table. "Sit," he growled, voice like gravel. She sank into a chair, her face pale, her defiance flickering. "Explain it, Maggie," he said, tapping the ledger. She laughed, a brittle, jagged sound that broke into sobs. "Luther's my brother," she whispered, voice cracking. "Half-brother, Dad's bastard with some barmaid. Kept it from you all these years. We ran scams as kids, petty theft cons. When he got out of prison 2 years back, he was broke, hunted by the Hollow Reapers. They'd kill him unless I helped." She spilled it all, her words tumbling like rocks in a landslide. Luther had turned the Reapers into his own crew, dealing meth and guns across Kentucky, killing anyone who crossed him. Tooth was his enforcer, a psycho who loved the blade. Margaret had tried to stay out, but Luther had dirt, photos of her from '89 unloading stolen goods with him, enough to send her away for years. "He dragged me in," she said, tears streaking her face. "At first it was money, cleaning their cash through the diner. Then it was bodies. I killed JP. He was gonna snitch. Luther made me cut his throat, said it'd prove my loyalty. I hated it, Sam, but I couldn't stop. The ledger tracked their kills too. The cash was her cut, stashed to buy her freedom from Luther's grip. I didn't want you dead, she pleaded, reaching for his hand. He pulled back, seeing only blood on her fingers. You're a liar, he said, voice hollow. He didn't trust her tears. Not anymore. He called Jack. It's time. Chapter 7, The Hollow's Inferno. Samuel and Jack devised a reckoning. They spread a rumour through a diner regular. Margaret was turning state's evidence, ready to spill on the reapers. The next night, Hollow Creek seethed with rage. Luther roared at her, his scar livid under the lantern light. Toothpaste, his blade glinted. Samuel and Jack hid in the trees, filming every word. Luther confessing to a dozen murders, Tooth bragging about carving bodies, Margaret begging to be let out. She's weak, Luther snarled. Her next one's hers, or she's me. Jack had tipped the F-days earlier, feeding them the ledger's scans and the ditch's coordinates. At 2 a.m., the feds rolled in, black fans cutting through the snow, floodlights blazing, the sirens splitting the night. Luther fired first, a shotgun blast shattering a windshield. Tooth lunged with his knife, slashing an agent's arm before a hail of bullets cut him down, his blood soaking the snow red. Luther charged, screaming obscenities, and took 3 rounds to the chest, collapsing in a heap. Margaret dropped her shovel, hands raised as agents swarmed her, cuffs snapping tight. The ditch gave up its dead. 11 bodies identified by dental records and tattoos, tied to Reaper hits stretching back years. The crates yielded $300,000 in cash and meth, bricks worth twice that of Luther's empire in ruins. Margaret's fingerprints were on the knife, her DNA on JPS tarp. Her confession on Jack's tape sealed her fate. Chapter 8. The Crimson Collapse. Margaret faced trial, her pleas of coercion crumbling under the weight of evidence. Photos, the ledger, her own recorded words. She got life without parole. Murder, conspiracy. No mercy for the blood she'd spilled. Luther's body was cremated, his ashes dumped unceremonied into the hollow. Tooth's corpse rotted in an unmarked grave. Samuel didn't stay for the sentencing. He torched the cabin, the flames licking the night sky as decades of their life burned to cinders. He sold his tools, loaded his truck, and vanished into the Kentucky backroads, a ghost of rage and grief. Chapter 9. The Hollow's echoes months later. Samuel holed up in a shack deep in the hills, miles from Crimson Hollow. He worked odd jobs, fixing fences, hauling scrap. His hands still strong, but his spirit hollowed out. The mines of Redstone carried on, their coal dust bearing the past, but the Hollow whispered in his dreams. Margaret's laugh, Luther's growl, the thud of a shovel in frozen earth. She sent a letter from prison, scrawled in shaky ink. Apologies, regrets, a plea to visit. He read it once, her words cutting like a blade, then fed it to the fire. The paper curled and blackened, her voice silenced at last. He walked the hills at night, the wind carrying the Hollow's echoes, wondering how 30 years could dissolve into blood and ash. The mines had taken his lungs. Margaret had taken his soul. He'd loved her once, loved her laugh, her strength, the way she'd hum old hymns while cooking. But that woman was gone, buried under the killer she'd become. Samuel didn't know if he'd ever find peace, but he knew one thing. Some shadows were too deep to escape, too crimson to fade. Epilogue. A hollow heart Crimson Hollow endured, its hills silent witnesses to the carnage. Samuel lived on, a shadow among shadows, haunted by the woman he'd lost and the monster she'd hidden. The railroad tracks still rumbled, the mines still coughed black, but the hollow held its secrets tight. Margaret rotted in a cell, her life reduced to concrete and steel. Sammy roamed free but caged by memory. He'd burned her letter, but her face lingered, etched in coal dust, stained in blood. Some debts he knew were paid only in silence, and some graves were never deep enough.